Hey, Spike here. If you haven't already joined us on Patreon, there's still time before we launch our first Q&A with John this Sunday at 8 p.m. UK time. That is 4 p.m. Eastern Time and 1 p.m. Pacific. Click on the link in the description and sign up, even for as low as $1 a month, and you'll be invited to our live streams and given early, commercial-free access to our videos, along with other goodies to be announced later. Now, on to the show.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack. You should know that by now. And I'm going to be talking with my excellent friend, Joe Szimhart. And first of all, I'm going to whinge about people not putting $1 in the box. And you're going to have to listen to this if you want to watch the channel henceforward. We've been doing this for 3 years. I've not taken a cent from it. My son Samuel's not taken a cent from it. And indeed, people have contributed equipment to us. So we're running at a loss. But Spike has engaged herself and given all that she has, which is quite a lot, to make sure that this channel looks good. And we simply can't keep doing it. So if we don't have PayPal subscriptions or Patreon subscriptions, and you can put $1, $5 a month in, if we're not getting that by May, then things will slow down significantly. I'm not going to stop talking to my friends, and we are going to post recordings, because when you know people like Joe Szimhart, you have to keep talking to them, because it's an experience. I always learn something useful from Joe, and he stretches my mind, and that's something I quite like, the exercise of the mind. So today, you know, we are overwhelmingly concerned at the barbaric acts taking place in Ukraine at the moment. And Joe's already put up an excellent video, which we'll put a link to, talking about Putin's brain. And we're going to talk a little further about Putin's Rasputin. Don't think they were related. And the wounded narcissist. So talk to us a little bit about the concept of the wounded narcissist, if you would, Joe.
Yeah, hi, John. Thank you. I had done that piece on Putin's brain, which led to some questions, and including this dialogue between you and I here. And it was based on the idea of Putin's philosopher, for want of a better word, Alexander Dugin, who was inspired in his personal philosophy by this guy, René Guénon, Frenchman who converted to Islam, Sufism, and developed something called traditionalism. But we were discussing something about, you know, what leads a person to adopt something like this, and then expand it into ideological totalism, meaning something which expands into everything that they think and do. And you can go back to this idea of the wounded narcissist, and you can see this in a character like Hitler and a lot of other people, even people that join cults and become cult leaders. There's something in their past, like with Putin, for instance. He felt quite wounded when the Soviet Empire, the Union, was falling apart, and it caught him off guard. And it seems, by all accounts, that he's been trying to regain that sense of grandiosity that he had at one time as being a member of a very important thing with the Soviet Union. And now he and Dugin see this as the center of the new Rome, the great new Roman Empire that is emerging in their so-called prophecy of traditionalism.
I mean, could I make a little side comment about the new Rome, that of course the Romanov Empire came about believing itself to be the successor to Constantinople and the continuation of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is not the first time this has happened in that part of the world. Right.
So it's a sign of personal and national grandiosity, if you want to boil it down, that comes from the idea that your narcissism, your self-concept, is wounded somehow deeply by something else, and you react against it, and then the reaction becomes totalistic. You know, this is what forms cults. You know, people feel, you know, some young minister feels wounded by his church. He goes out and starts a new little movement. and he gets some followers, and suddenly he becomes this autocrat, because he feels great about what he's saying. But I mentioned this idea of traditionalism, which was introduced by Guénon, and the idea is, in Guénon's head, is that tradition, the true tradition, goes back to something called the perennial wisdom, which existed in the golden age of mankind, or the golden age of whatever. The Greeks had this idea, Hindus had this idea, certainly, of the Sat Yuga. And Guénon turned to Hinduism in order to grasp, even though he was a Sufi, he turned to Hinduism to get this idea of the golden age and what that is and how we have to recreate it. He also believed in that a tradition needs initiation. So you need to have something to be initiated into, some mystery. So, the idea of Freemasonry and all of this influenced him, because they have great initiatic rituals.
But, I mean, there's also the idea that's put forward by the likes of Idris Shah that the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, these secret societies, in fact, have their origins in Sufi societies.
Right, and the idea of the secret is that you're entering into the unknowable, so it is secret. And so you kind of parody that by not letting other people know what you know. In other words, you are in the unknowable. It's silliness when you boil it down, because the great cosmos out there just laughing at us, tiny little things on Earth here doing this crazy stuff. But we believe, from our point of view, that we're participating in this great cosmic mystery, which is what Guénon was trying to sell here, and Dugin tries to sell in his ideas. However, I'm referring to this book, Against the Modern World, by Sedgwick, Mark Sedgwick, and it's called Traditionalism and the Secret Intellectual History of the 20th Century. It's quite good in its analysis of this, but so I want to bring up two things, and then we can open up discussion. He talks about this traditionalism, which a lot of people point to as the origin of some of these ideas, like Julius Evola borrowed from Guénon's traditionalism to influence Mussolini.
Yeah.
But Mussolini and Hitler, although they believed in a kind of traditionalism, went further. And what Sedgwick says, in the end, traditionalism played no significant role in either Italian fascism or German Nazism, despite Evola's efforts. This was so partly because the later Mussolini was little interested in ideology, and Hitler was his own ideologist. In other words, they were very grandiose. They went beyond all of this talk about tradition.
Yeah, they believed they had direct access themselves. They didn't need to look back.
Right, and they embodied that access, right? So neither they nor their regimes had any need of Evola. A more basic reason was that Evola's elitist conceptions were hardly compatible with the mass character which the fascist and Nazi regimes assumed in practice, if not always in theory. So they transcended mere traditionalism. They were ego-driven in a sense, and enjoyed the grandiosity, the adulation that they were able to form. So getting back to Dugin's Eurasianism, or what's called Neo-Eurasianism, the New Rome that he influences Putin with, Sedgwick says here that beyond this explanation, which is that about Dugin's ideas, we must look at the modifications Dugin made to the traditionalist philosophy, and also at the special characteristics of Russian political life in the immediate post-Soviet period. Dugin's first modification was to correct Guénon's understanding of Orthodox Christianity, drawing a parallel with Coomaraswamy's earlier correction of Guénon's views on Buddhism. Coomaraswamy was a traditionalist that was a friend of Mircea Eliade and studied Guénon and believed in the Indian Buddhist idea of tradition and promoted all of that. Yeah. Ananda Coomaraswamy was his name. He wanted to do something parallel to that, a correction of Guénon's views. This correction is most clearly articulated in his Metaphysica Blagiavesti Pravoslavny Esotericism, Metaphysics of the Gospel, Orthodox Esotericism. So he's talking about the Russian Orthodox Church here. Here Dugin argues that the Christianity that Guénon rejected was Western Catholicism, Guénon was right in rejecting Catholicism, but wrong in rejecting Eastern Orthodoxy, of which he knew little. According to Dugin, Orthodoxy, unlike Catholicism, had never lost its initiatic quality, and that's important for a traditionalist. It has to have an initiatic quality.
Yeah.
And so remained a valid tradition to which a traditionalist might turn. Dugin then proceeded to translate much of the traditional philosophy into Orthodox terms. Thus reoriented, Dugin's traditionalism led not to Sufism, which it led in Guénon.
Yeah.
So this is where he separates from Guénon, not to Sufism as the esoteric practice of Islam, but to Russian Orthodoxy as both an esoteric and an exoteric practice. So this gives you some idea that these traditionalists are not of one mind. They kind of split and reorient the idea of tradition according to how they want to see it. You know, so having said that, this is how we ended up with Putin's, you know, promotion and protection of the Orthodox Church, and having some people, especially one confessor that maybe you can talk about a little bit, become his primary inspiration for this Orthodox tradition that's at the heart and soul of Russia, is how he wants to see it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about Tikron, who is put forward as Putin's confessor. I know very little about him. You can check him on Wikipedia. I think the important thing is the way that an idea is adopted as an ideal, the way that history is reconstructed to appear to have come to that ideal. So if we just take one notion within Guénon, that this idea of a perennial philosophy, a golden age from which we have fallen, this is fundamental to so many imaginary beliefs. The idea that there was a Garden of Eden, and this is not in any way a metaphor, and we see even that myth transforming, because of course I've said this often before, but when you go back to the Babylonian seals, which show you a version of the Garden of Eden which predates the earliest Hebrew versions, which are perhaps 900 BC, you can go back to 2500 BC and you have a story of Eden and the Golden Age, where the mother goddess is using the father god, the snake, to invite humanity into the garden to take dates from the date palms. And so the story has been moved, and it then is taken to be a truth. With Judaism, that it's probably the time of Ezra, after the Babylonian captivity in the 5th century, where these stories, which have been gathered, you know, and come from different cultures, we're told in the Bible that the Hebrew culture, and therefore Christian and Islam culture, comes from Abraham or Abram in Ur, in the Sumerian Babylonian heartland.
Yeah, I think specifically the Canaanite peoples. The language originates in ancient Canaan.
Yeah, and they are so-called Semitic peoples. In origins, that means the Babylonians, Akkadians, the Arabs, the Jews. But what happens is that it all changes to fit in with a particular new form. And that particular, it's like the imagined communities, that notion, Benedict Anderson, that you'll now have people who believe they are English or American, or, you know, they belong to this particular national type, which is a very modern idea. It's something that's only come around in the last 200-300 years. Yeah. This idea, rather than you belonged to and were a chattel, a movable good of the king or queen, that the monarch owned you, and you did what you did because you were bullied into doing it. I mean, I have patriotism where you do it because it has become an expression of your identity, yourself. A friend of mine, he was doing a psychology degree about 25 years ago, and he was interested in identity. And when he asked people in England what their identity was, they say, I'm a carpenter, I'm a builder, I'm an accountant. That was the answer to the question. When he went to Northern Ireland, and he came from Northern Ireland, and he asked people what their identity was, they said, I'm British. Oh. And so you saw this difference. And in fact, they're not British. whichever way you look at it, is the kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, but they saw their identity as being part of that. And this sense of who am I? What do I represent becomes vital when we're talking about somebody like Putin or Hitler, that, as you say, their sense of identity extends to them being, in Putin's case, a Russian. We have a strangely anomalous situation at the moment, which is, of course, what we call the Russian Empire is the Ukrainian Empire. Ukraine was the foundation of this empire in the 9th century, and moved its headquarters to Moscow, I think, the 13th century, after the depredations of the Mongols. So what this identity might be, or what it's claimed to be, that brings us down to Aryan or Pan-Slavic purity. This, Robert J. Lifton's demand for purity, this idea that there are human beings who go back to some.
Well, you bring up a very good point. If in fact the heart of the Russian language, the Russian culture, is geographically in the Ukraine, you can understand why he's even driven even more to conquer and own it, because he's owning his own identity in a sense. I mean, it might be subconscious. I don't know, but obviously it's more than that. But this is a very important territory for him. He's willing to risk it all, even a third world war, to get it, which tells you something.
It is. He's risking absolutely everything. He's risking the survival of the human race,
as we know it.
Well, I mean, it is quite possible, if he loosed the 1,600 nuclear weapons that he has, that no human being would survive. Well,
we would lose as many.
Yeah, I mean,
the US.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the US has about 5 times that amount. So, and maybe China, India, Pakistan, Israel would all join in. But we do have the possibility of making the atmosphere so radioactive that even the cockroaches will not survive, and which is a sad thought. But not to me. That what a crossroads in history when somebody is willing to take their identity matters that much to them. And again, before we came on, we talked about Hitler's last month, where Admiral Dönitz and even Himmler were begging Hitler to stop the war. And Hitler basically went, they don't deserve me. If they were good enough, then they would have won. They deserve to be annihilated. Those similar conversations, I found to my amazement, were had during World War I among the German High Command, because of this misinterpretation of the Darwinian survival of the fittest.
Right. It became, social Darwinism became the weapon of these people.
And was believed to be a truth. And here we have the problem that Putin and Dugin and Tikron believe this to be true, and therefore inevitable, and they have to do this.
But think about this, John, how we're programmed by our own history, geopolitical, geological, religious. You have an ancient god in the Jewish tradition and in others as well, that wanted to wipe out the human race.
Well, and I can understand why, frankly.
Yeah, and then when we look at just beyond the emergence of humanity and back to the great dinosaur age, we have this universe which apparently can, willy-nilly wipe out, almost every species on Earth by throwing a rock at it. And so what kind of a will is behind that is what we have to question. Is that who we are? We come from stardust, as they say. Is this who we are? Do we somehow implode every now and then by nature in order to see what the fascists were saying, that if you through war wipe out everything, the new culture will emerge much stronger.
War is the hygiene of the nation, as Mussolini put it.
Yes. So I'm looking at this from a cosmic standpoint, because the cosmos throws rocks at Earth and now and then wipes things out. And can you call that cosmos God or God's will? What do you call that? And by the same token, we do it in small ways, like Genghis Khan going across to the west and saying he wasn't victorious unless his horsemen could gallop at full speed across the conquered city and not trip on a stone. Is that what we're facing here?
Yeah, and I don't believe in an animus within the cosmos. Though I do incline towards the notion of a Tao, the notion of something out of which the cosmos arises, but I don't see motivation and purpose or reason or design. I love the idea of evolution, the idea that once you set it going, it becomes complicated. Yeah. So, but unfortunately, there are people who come to believe in incredibly destructive concepts, which they then become willing to kill and die for. And forms of imperialism, forms of domination, and they're forms of self, of internecine and self-destructive insanity.
But they're also willing to lie for it. And this is what's driving a lot of this. You look at the propaganda, for instance, what we hear about going on in Russian television, as opposed to, what we're seeing on the ground. It's an incredible effort to reframe reality into some personal delusion. And it's all about gaining more power over people, manipulating the masses and so forth. So, so this willingness to lie for your cause is quite I think almost at the heart of this issue, and getting people to lie to themselves. Yeah. That in fact, this is a good thing. This is a good thing to kill my neighbor. That kind of lie.
You have to, and as Hitler said, if you tell a big enough lie, the world will believe it.
Or they won't begin to doubt it as much. That's all he wanted. He just wanted people to back off.
Yeah, or to become so confused that you don't know what the truth is. One of my first questions, talking to a friend who's of Ukrainian descent, was to say, can Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers understand each other? And he said yes. And that made me think about the first battalions that went into Tiananmen Square. Who of course spoke, I think, Cantonese, as did the protesters, and they left. They were convinced by the protesters, and so then battalions were sent in who did not speak the language and told all sorts of stories. We're now hearing about the idea of Syrian troops being sent into the Ukraine. It's because the other thing that's happened is, of course, Ukraine and Russia have been were integrated for so long that there are many people, many Russians in Ukraine, many Ukrainians in Russia, and they're the families of each. And communication has not been stopped. I was rather sad to find that I can no longer look at RT. When things were happening in the Arab world, I wanted to be able to watch Al Jazeera and see what the other point of view was. I don't know if there's some fear about the propaganda value that people might start, believing RT in some way, and some of the dreadful, people like Alex Salmon, who was a Scottish politician here and defected them, the late Larry King. I mean, how fascinating. Yeah. But I don't think that there's any credibility in RT, having read Peter Pomerantsev, a couple of his books, who was working in Moscow and seeing how the machine is controlled. And that actually by opening that up, we live in a different time where the age of radio was probably the age when it was most possible to control a whole population. You could restrict information. Now it's become very difficult. And I imagine a huge crisis of conscience is taking place in Russia, and thousands of incredibly brave people are risking their lives to stand up and say, stop doing this. But what we're seeing is it's so relevant to the field we've worked in, because what we are seeing is an authoritarian cult that is at the center of the governance of Russia. And it's important not to believe that the Russians want to do this to the Ukrainians. It is the cult that has the power in Russia that seeks to do this. and a pretty horrible job they're making of it. Hopefully they will fail as badly as they did in Afghanistan, where a bunch of goat herds were able to beat them, but we wait.
Well, I think that's the game being played now. Is it's one thing to support the rebels against the Russians in Afghanistan, as we did, and giving them Stinger missiles and all of that, and not risk a third world war. But it's another thing when we're now supporting what Putin and his regimes are saying is a neo-fascist aspect that's controlling their Slavic people in Ukraine, and they're fighting to free their Slavic people. The Afghans were not Slavic people. So there's a big difference here right now in terms of what they might do in order to protect themselves. They're thinking this isn't about taking over a country. This is about self-protection in their mind.
However, what we're seeing, it's a military machine itself, and the idea that the 2 million strong Russian army could have failed in Afghanistan. Obviously, the terrain is very different as well.
Yeah.
One recent comments being made is that, while on the one hand talking about liberating these people, very evidently this is a campaign of annihilation, as was waged in Syria.
But Syria, I think, is the best example of what's going on here.
You if somebody stands up against you, you raise them to the ground. I am going to make a controversial point here, which is historically true, and that is, yes, best thing to do. During World War II, this was a policy of the Allies towards Dresden, towards Berlin, and in the Korean War, one of the shocking pieces of information to me is that not a single North Korean town was left standing at the end of that war. So this, and in Vietnam as well, this idea of wiping out the opponent and all opposition, which will never succeed unless you can kill everyone. As Sun Tzu pointed out in The Art of War, if you leave anybody behind, they will come and get you. And to say that you are seeking, I think the Russian propaganda will have to collapse, because you can't blow up schools and hospitals and leave ruins and still claim that you in some way have any respect for the people you're murdering. So,
I think the Ukrainian response, which I call the democratic, free-thinking Ukrainian response, because they've been energized by European ideas, so to speak, and expressing themselves that way. They don't want to let that go. And so the fact that there's not enough people in Ukraine to side with the Russian tradition of Pan-Slavism and Putin's crazy ideas that are inspired by Dugin, I think is the biggest blow to Putin right now, is that psychologically he's got to be struggling with what's he going to end up with here. A 20-30 year war of economic war, information war, all kinds of other aspects. And so he's going to be like someone trapped in a corner. What will he do about this? Especially if China is waffling on backing him.
Yes, which seems to be the important point, that a few weeks before this began, we had a pact between them, which was, perhaps something like the non-aggression pact between von Ribbentrop and Molotov, or Hitler and Stalin, but not fully truthful. But we haven't actually had an alliance since Mao and Stalin. So since about 1952, there's been no alliance between Russia and China. It looked as if one might be coming along. China is, of course, a great deal more powerful than Russia, militarily and economically, and that they are not backing this has left Russia completely isolated from the world. Economically, if they take the Ukraine, they will be, just as China used to be, they'll be a country isolated from the rest of the world, because nobody wants to do business with them. And while they do have gas and oil, they do not, and steel, iron ore, they don't have sufficient materials to actually maintain an economy. And if they're shunned by the world, the ruble is not worth anything, then the next 10 years are going to be pretty grim for anybody within that situation. The other thing, and this is something that I don't think is generally recognized about China either, is that it isn't a matter of everybody loves the leadership and they're following them. China is actually having riots on a weekly basis and has done for decades. The Chinese people are not simply compliant. Russia, I was in Russia in 2014 and it was an incredible privilege. I was in St. Petersburg and it was a wonderful experience. I was there to talk to a conference of 200 men in black, that's what it looked like to me, who are basically almost all of them priests of the Orthodox Church. And when very soon afterwards, Russia basically began a war on the Ukraine, took the Crimea and what have you, and the West pretty much ignored that. And by the beginning of this invasion, there had been 14,000 to 15,000 deaths already in the Ukraine, with a constant battle going on the eastern side of the country. But what I saw in St. Petersburg was Ukrainian priests embracing Russian priests. I saw no conflict between the various aspects of the Orthodox Church, and indeed all of the leaders of the Orthodox Church in Greece, in Jerusalem, and Poland.
So what were you addressing them or speaking about the cult thing, or what were you doing there?
Yeah, I was asked to give a speech to conference there, and about Scientology. In fact, it's we published it. It's because it was such a long talk. Scientology's Cult of Greed, and the idea was to basically say something that could be, for people who knew nothing about Scientology or cults, and point to some of the worst excesses. And I became friends with the Archbishop of Crete while I was there, who we spent about 5 hours chatting, a quite remarkable man. And I was very impressed. And what you said at the beginning about the difference between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, it is very significant. You can see it in the internal, external aspect of it. You can see it in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, that you see that there's been this thing going on in the Orthodox Church where you have the public church and you have the mystics within it, and they are not easy with one another. In the Catholic Church, mysticism, quietism has largely been suppressed. So it is largely a public body that deals with the people, whereas you have, that Mount Athos in Greece, where you have a monastic tradition that runs alongside. And some part of this seems to have been perverted into what we're hearing from Dugin. And as you say, allied to Pan-Slavism, which is something that grew up at the same time as Aryan race theory in Austria, because you had so many nationalities and so many tongues being spoken that it fomented discord. And so, German speakers took Madame Blavatsky's ridiculous idea of Aryanism, and Slavic speakers started to say, well, no, we should be separate. I mean, if there's one thing that we do know from evolution, and we do know it, that is that the more we interbreed different types, the stronger the human race will become. So the more we try and hybridize, the more we will end up with King Charles Spaniels whose skulls are not big enough to take their brains. And I think
I think that's a good symbol. I mean, Lifton calls this psychosocial constriction. When you have ideological totalism, you separate yourself from a broader range of reference, and as a result, you can't enrich yourself. Yes. And I think this is part of the battle between the basic assumptions of the left and the right, is that the idea that if we go global, we're going to lose our national identity. We won't know who we are, and we will become watered down species and weaker and blah, blah, blah. Where in fact, just the opposite usually takes place, because, when you have migrations of people and combat and taking over territory and interbreeding and all of that, you often have a stronger tribe that then emerges. I mean, even my Hungarian people, we speak one language, but the original peoples that came in there were like 7 or 9 different tribes that had different dialects, that merged into the Hungarian dominant language. So they didn't start out pure as some kind of a golden age of Hungarians. There is no such thing. There never was. And I think it's true of the human race as well. So, I think as we were talking in the beginning, we live between these two bookends of imaginary ideology of the Garden of Eden on one hand and heaven on the other. That if we look back far enough, we end up in heaven. And if we look far enough ahead, in some God place, we end up in heaven too. But in the here and now, we're in hell. Kind of an idea.
And the same is true outside of theistic belief, that we have the socialist paradise, that we can sacrifice our lives so that our grandchildren will live in this socialist paradise. Well, I'd just like to point out that the generation of Marx's grandchildren is long dead. It didn't happen. Though many good things did come from, today I was reminded, Studs Terkel, the great broadcaster, was stood at a bus stop in Chicago one day, and he heard 2 yuppies talking about how dreadful socialism was. And he turned to them, he said, how many hours a week do you work? He said, well, 40. And he said, and that's because trade unions forced people into reducing the working day. I mean, my great-grandfather in the 19th century worked a 12-hour day, 5 days a week, and half days on Saturday. The gift of the Industrial Revolution. It's not the way it was in the Middle Ages. This incredible pressure came from astonishing wealth being given to a small number of people, which is exactly what happened in Russia under Yeltsin and further under Putin, that by following Milton Friedman's incredibly devastating and stupid monetarist ideas, they handed over the control of their resources to a tiny group of people who did not have the moral qualifications to be in charge. So one of them does own Chelsea Football Club now. At least that's something. It's funny because I talked at Eton College on Monday, which was fantastic. And it was very interesting as I told people I was going to be talking at Eton. Several of my friends were sort of, all of these rich kids, and how awful this was and how to say something about how they were training authoritarians. And I found exactly the opposite was true, that this is actually a very open and easygoing place there, very compassionate and concerned about the boys there. But two things I was told, which I'll make public. Firstly, they do not have the children of any of the oligarchs who are being restricted. There is not one child there who belongs to a family that is part of this catastrophe. So no, they won't be throwing anybody out. The second point is that they made a public protest against the Ukraine war, where they projected the Ukrainian flag onto the buildings of Eton. So
I saw that in the ad. So, wonderful.
But the way we form our identity, this is something that absolutely fascinates me. What am I? Am I English? When talking about the history of the English, the British, I seek to say they, not we. When we won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, because I cannot see that my identity is within that. When a friend of mine was talking about being a patriotic American, and I said, are you patriotic towards Democrats as well? Are you patriotic towards, his father was an immigrant, from South Africa. What do you mean by patriotism? And when we looked the word up in the dictionary, he was a little surprised to find that it included the willingness to die for your country. What is your country? It's an imagined thing. I live in a country that's rare in all the world because its boundaries were laid in 1066. We haven't been invaded again since then. But there isn't anywhere else that I'm aware of where the boundaries haven't moved. And thankfully, where interbreeding hasn't taken place, because you interbreed, you end up with, the Habsburg chin or the madness of King George or the Cavendish banana. as soon as a disease for bananas comes along, all the bananas in the world will be gone, because there is only one species of banana. Maybe red, it may be yellow, but there's only one species. Our strength, our immunity to diseases comes about through us.
You know, you bring up
Our
something
culture.
interesting. Genetically, yeah, you're correct. Obviously, I mean, it doesn't always work, but generally that works very well. And linguistically, you think about language evolves in each country, becomes much richer over time because of its infusion of words from other languages.
Yeah.
You know, for instance, the English word coach comes from the Hungarian word kocsis, which was the coach driver. So there you go. You're speaking Hungarian when you say coach.
And I live in a bungalow, which is the word from Bengal, and I eat chutney, and that comes from the man who will soon be my father-in-law taught English teachers to teach English. And when he was a younger man and teaching himself, he put up a series of words and a map and showed a link to where these English words come from. And he said that his pupils were quite upset. I thought this wasn't English. And you go, well, you know, let's dig all the way into prehistory. As far as we know, the inhabitants of these islands, the British Isles where I live, came from two places originally. One of them is the Middle East.
Yeah.
The other is Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we are now talking about taking a lot of Ukrainian refugees, but it's a homecoming for them. Let's face it. They're
Interesting.
their original people. It's also true. I think it's Adam Rutherford, or is it Adam Henderson? But we have a geneticist who's written a couple of books and points out that we share, you know, genetic makeup from everywhere. There is absolutely no purity. We have genes that Aboriginal Australians, although they're 40,000 years separated from us, that we share with them.
But see, think about this, you know, because there is this idea of the pure race out there, right? And it's not completely wrong in that sense. You know, look at I have a dog that you heard barking in the background. It's an English Shepherd, which kind of looks a little bit like the Border Collie, but it's an older breed, and it's a farm dog. It's a farm collie. It came from Scotland, and it was brought to the US and then developed into a United States farm dog. Now I have that dog, and I had it genetically tested, and it comes up English Shepherd back to the 10th generation. It's a pure English Shepherd. Now I got it from a farm. These dogs are not AKC registered. You know, they're not show dogs. They're just working dogs, but it's a pure English Shepherd. So even though it has a little bit of wolfishness in it, 4%, which all dogs do to some degree, you know, from 1% to 4% on the average dog, and whatever, but it's developed into this genetic code called English Shepherd. So when you think about breeding the human race and bringing it back to some kind of purity, if you keep genetically interbreeding, so to speak, in a nation, you come up with more of a Germanic people, you know, let's say, or an Aryan people, as opposed to people breeding in the Congo, you know, and developing their genetic makeup in that particular territory. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is the development of race and ethnicity rather than the origin of it, because there is no origin, you know, except in some, you know, genetic freak that parted from the apes. But so I'm going to bring this discussion back to traditionalism that we brought up, and in this book again by Sedgwick, he's pointing out, you know, and to use a small example of Romania, Mircea Eliade, the great historian of religions, was also a traditionalist when he was younger. He was a friend of Julius of Evolas. They wrote quite a bit together. But Eliade became much more academic and broad in his perspective on mysticism and all of that, and corrected himself as he went along. But when he was young, he was quite fascist, in quotes. You know, he belonged to some degree to something called the Legion of St. Michael, which was a super Christian organization, ultra Christian organization in Romania. And anyway, Sedgwick says that the legionary of St. Michael movement, according to Iliad, was distinct from all others in being spiritual rather than political, whereas communism acted in the name of economics, fascism in the name of state, and Nazism in the name of race. The legionary movement acted in the name of Christianity. That's Iliad speaking.
Yes.
So he's breaking it down how he saw it. And then the writer says, not that Iliad dismissed race altogether. On at least two occasions, he wrote in a publication called Vermeia on the need to purify Romanian race of Jewish and Hungarian influences, once in an article titled Bucharesti Centru Viral, or Bucharest, a viral center, a virile center. You know, so this idea of the virility of the race is really important to these people. The virility of the Nazi youth. You know, Hitler had these camps and these schools and set up, and they measured them for type and size, and you know, and actually tried to breed the super race, you know, to make it more virile. Yeah.
The ANNENEB, the 50 ministries, 50 department ministry that was run by Himmler, also had the Lebensborn, and that links back to Madame Blavatsky's ludicrous ideas that the Aryans are the survivors of Atlantis, and they had superpowers. And the first writers about the Aryans talked about them having electron powers, because the word electron had just come into the language. And Himmler believed that, and incredible resources were put into this. Himmler believed that by breeding through the Lebensborn, where there'd be selective human breeding, only those with the bluest eyes, unlike Hitler, only those who were over 6 foot tall, unlike Hitler, only those with blonde hair, unlike Hitler, would be able to father children, and the most famous of whom is the dark-haired woman in ABBA. She was a Lebensborn child.
Oh, yeah.
So not Swedish by birth. But he sincerely believed, Himmler sincerely believed, that the Lebensborn would gradually develop supernatural powers. They'd be able to be very much like Scientology's operating thetans.
Yes. Well, this is a new age idea that we're evolving and we're going to be more psychic. And, you know, if we want to plant a garden, we just think it and it'll grow.
Oh, what a good idea.
I wonder about that.
It's been 2 weeks.
Yeah, I've got to cut this off in about 5 minutes here. So last words.
Well, I think it's fascinating, and it, as ever with our discussions, it leaves so much more to be explored.
Oh yeah.
But it is about the fundamental thing is where people, Voltaire, people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities, and here we are seeing this yet again. And what does hearten me is I don't remember in my lifetime seeing anything around the world like the support for Ukraine. And, you know, it's in the Russian communities in the rest of the world, it's in Russia itself. So this isn't a matter of, you know, black versus white or something.
No, there's an African ambassador that spoke out eloquently in support of Ukraine and against Putin at the United Nations. I mean, this is worldwide.
Yes. And you know, that heartened me with the Iraq war, that although our idiotic Prime Minister Tony Blair took us into a war to bring democracy to Iraq, which hasn't actually happened, against the feelings of the people. But 1 million people marched against it. It was not like the First World War, where people were handing out white feathers and forcing everybody to go to be slaughtered. And 80% of people in this country, a democracy, though Tony Blair didn't seem to realize that, said, not in my name. I don't want to do this. And at the moment, you know, all we have is what we can do to shame Putin and his gang of thugs into changing their minds and making it impossible for them to pursue this cause. So any final words on your part, Joe?
Well, changing his mind, good luck with that. You know, like Lifton said, this kind of thing takes on a momentum of its own, even beyond the authoritarian leaders. They get caught up in it themselves. And, you know, much like Charlie Manson and Hitler, they just carried their actions through despite how crazy their ideology was.
Well, let's
And,
say
and
that
thought they could get away with it. You know?
Hitler's mind was changed in the end by a bullet. So
Right.
it might be that severe, but decoupling Putin from power in some way and allowing the Russian people to their liberty from his ideas. And also, let's look back and remember what he did in Chechnya, and remember that the West did absolutely nothing to protect Chechnya.
Yeah. On the other side, we have to look at what happened to Mussolini and to Ceausescu. You know, they were slaughtered in the end by their own people.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's what Putin's most afraid of, and let's hope it happens sooner than later.
Let's hope that he's removed from power by whatever means. And you know, I would always prefer that seriously dangerous people, I managed to say it eventually, will actually survive and be sat down and write their autobiographies, so that we can better understand the particular form of psychosis or psychopathy with which they are infested, and avoid it in future. But here's hoping for the liberation of Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you very much. It was an extension of my short video, and able to expand on it. I appreciate the opportunity, and good talking to you again.
As ever. Thank you so much, John.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.